Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to another Vampire Read-Throughs. Yes, it's summer. And what's an important thing to do in the summer besides stay in your crypt and avoid the hot, hot day ball? Why, your summer reading, of course. But Maven, you say, who wants to read? Reading is for suckers. Well, fortunately for you, I am a sucker, and I'm here to read to you vampire stories. Isn't that so much better? And tonight, we are going to tackle another classic of early, formative vampire literature, Carmilla, by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Don't let his fancy French name fool you. Le Fanu was an Irishman, much like Bram Stoker. He was actually of the generation of literary figures in that land just before Bram Stoker, and it's often speculated that Bram Stoker was influenced by Le Fanu and might have grown up familiar with his stories. And Le Fanu was mostly known for writing ghost stories, very classic Victorian ghost stories. He wrote all genres, really, but his horror was what he was most well known for. And although he never really got rich and famous from his literary career, he did all right. Though he liked to think he got rich and famous, so he kind of lived beyond his means, but that's another story. And Le Fanu wrote arguably one of the most important vampire stories of that era. Not long ago, we discussed The Vampire by Jean William Polidori, and I told you that it was the first vampire fiction that was a vampire fiction that was so important literarily that it influenced all other vampire fiction. Obviously, it wasn't the first vampire story ever written, but it was the first one of vampire stories as we know them. And Carmilla is a story that very much builds on the prototype that the vampires set up. It was first published as a serial in 1871, finished in 1872, and then Le Fanu released it in a print publication of 5 of his stories called In a Glass Darkly. So literary, much reference. It is not a short story, it's a long story. It's not a novel, it's only about 24,000 words, which is kind of the length of 2.5 short stories. It's not even really a novella. It's even shorter than that. You can't really ever find it by itself. It's usually published in anthology with other stories because it is so short and it helps build up that public domain padded book length for big anthologies. And I have it in 2 anthologies. Again, I'm bringing back The Phantom of the Opera and Other Gothic Tales. This is one of Barnes & Noble's fancy leather-bound, gilt-edged, red ribbon, fancy end paper editions. They have a whole bunch of these. Phantom of the Opera and Other Gothic Tales, not to be confused with their horror anthology, their ghost story anthology. There's a whole bunch. But Carmilla is considered one of the Gothic tales, much like The Vampire by Polidori, and those are in here, unlike the Bram Stoker later Dracula stories, which are in their Bram Stoker collection. This is a very beautiful book. I love it muchly. However, the copy of Carmilla that's in here is actually missing the prologue. So it's kind of incomplete. Like, the prologue's only a page long. I don't know why they would have cut that out when the rest of the story is in here, but we won't be reading this version. The other copy I have is in Vampires First Blood, The Undead Before Dracula, an anthology. It's a 2-volume anthology, and it's split. It's all the vampire stories of note that existed around the world as compiled by this editor, James Grant Golden, split into 2 versions. This is the Vampire Lords, all the stories about male vampires, and this is the Vampire Ladies, all the story about female vampires. And the editor explains in the introduction to this book why he split the men and the women, because male vampires, he found, mean so many different things metaphorically and are framed in such a different way from female vampires historically. And keep in mind, these are only the vampires that existed before Dracula. So actually, the very last story in this book is Dracula's Guest, which, as we read last time, was from an early draft of Dracula and featured a female vampire, even though she didn't do much. She just kind of laid there and existed. But that is the last story in here. I guess technically the last vampire story published before Dracula, the real version, was officially published. And all the stories in this book are in chronological order, and Carmilla is here. So you can see this much are female vampires that existed before Carmilla. So Carmilla was not the first female vampire. And this actually isn't even entirely comprehensive. One of Carmilla's chief influences was Geraldine from the poem Christabel by Coleridge. And that's not included in here at all. Geraldine is technically not a vampire. Coleridge never actually finished the poem Christabel, so we don't know what Geraldine was supposed to be, but she was some sort of magical supernatural creature. And most scholars cite Christabel as the chief influence for the plot of Carmilla. And I will explain that as we get into it. The unfinished poem of Christabel was started in the 1700s, and I think I neglected to mention this before, but you know how with The Vampire by Polidori we're talking about that vacation Lord Byron and all his buddies were taking, where Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein and Lord Byron wrote his unfinished draft that Polidori eventually turned into The Vampire. Well, at that party, while they were all locked inside during the storm telling each other ghost stories, they actually read Christabel out loud to each other, and it formed an inspiration for Byron's story that then formed the inspiration for Polidori's story, and people argue influenced Frankenstein as well. So this little snippet of an unfinished poem was very influential. And if you're unfamiliar with Christabel, the gist is that this innocent young maiden, Christabel, who lives in this very gothic place with a forest, goes out into the forest one day and she meets this mysterious, beautiful lady, Geraldine. And Geraldine says, "Help, I'm a damsel in distress and I need help." So Christabel says, "You can come home with me, beautiful lady." And she takes her home, and she starts noticing strange things about Christabel, like she's following fairy rules or witch rules, and she has a witch's mark, and she can't touch iron, and all these things. But of course, Christabel is so innocent that she doesn't notice, but the reader is supposed to notice, and the reader is supposed to start feeling worried for Christabel. And when they go into Christabel's room and they're getting undressed for bed, she notices on Geraldine this horrible mark on her body and has this moment of horror like, oh no, I'm going to sleep in bed with this girl and she's got this witch's mark. But meanwhile, Geraldine is acting innocent. She's not acting like a creepy monster or a sinister figure. She's acting very sweet and innocent. And it's that premise of someone pretending to be your friend, of pretending to be a victim or an innocent person to get you to invite them into their home, into where you live, so that then they can ostensibly prey upon you. And this is what Polidori and Byron borrowed for their vampire story that they kind of co-wrote, they kind of co-did everything together, of that vampire figure pretending to be someone normal to trick you into trusting them, to trick you into sharing your life with them so that they can then prey upon you later. And I wouldn't say that Coleridge was the first person to come up with this idea, but this specific poem version of this idea was what directly influenced all these people. Poor Coleridge, he was so insecure about his writing and he thought nobody liked it that he never finished his poem. And people were like mean to him too, and so he was like, I guess I do suck. I'm never going to finish this highly influential poem that's going to change Western literature forever. Think of what we could have had if he did. Back to this book. So, The Undead Before Dracula, Vampires, First Blood, Volume 2, The Vampire Ladies, has Carmilla in here. And I love this book because it gives historical context before and after his story. That also has a glossary of terms or like footnotes for historical personages or references that you might not have normally realized. The more and more I read into this set, the more and more I appreciate it. So if you're looking for vampire stories, highly recommended. And since this version actually includes the prologue, we're going to read this one. Now, there is no proof that Bram Stoker was directly influenced by Carmilla when he wrote Dracula, but there is so much coincidental between Carmilla and Dracula. Just the way the vampires work, the way the vampire rules are that hadn't been done anywhere else before, that you think, well, Bram Stoker obviously borrowed this from Carmilla. He didn't come up with this simultaneously, magically, entirely on his own when Le Fanu had been the first one to do it that many years before. This was published in 1872, finished version, and Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1895, even though it took him, 10 years to write it. And, of course, as we learned last time when we were reading Dracula's Guest, the first draft thrown out bit of what eventually went on to become Dracula, there were specific references to Carmilla that kind of prove Bram Stoker must have at least been familiar with it. And none of those references made it into the finished version of Dracula, but knowing that this Dracula's guest was originally part of it, the point I'm trying to make is if it weren't for Carmilla, we wouldn't have Dracula as we know it today. So this is a very important story. And if you're not familiar with Carmilla, you're about to be, because lady vampires do not get enough credit. And yes, obviously, a lot of lady vampires came before Carmilla, but Carmilla was a trendsetter for a lot of the vampire tropes that actually wound up lasting, sticking around into pop culture to this day, that a lot of these vampires have been completely forgotten, didn't have that same lasting impression. One of the things that the editor of this book points out is that one of the differences between male vampires and female vampires of this pre-Dracula era is that the female vampires always represented transgression a lot more. For the male vampires, they were predators. They were all based on that Byronic trope of someone who was rich and privileged preying on people who were less powerful than they were. This type of monster. This classy, urbane, wealthy, almost desirable in some ways monster. Whereas the female vampires, even if they still had wealth or beauty or class, the fact that they had any power at all in this era was in its very nature transgressive. And he mentions that all these vampires are transgressive in different ways, and some of them because they reject gender stereotypes, some of them because they are more powerful than men, some of them because they're not mother figures enough, some of them were just too sexy to be endured. Women aren't supposed to desire men, pshaw, not proper ladies. Well, Carmilla doesn't desire men. Carmilla is transgressive because of the homoeroticism. One interesting thing that the editor of this book points out is that besides being the biggest, most influential female vampire of the era that brought forward into modern times, Carmilla was also the last female vampire that was really a character for a very long time. And most female vampires that came after Carmilla were background or side characters, very one-dimensional, very shallow. So it's intriguing to think how a female vampire could be done so well as Carmilla and then have it be the end. This editor considers that maybe it's because she came out right around at the time when women's rights, women's liberation was all starting to come out with the suffragette movement, and this wasn't that long before then. So writing these powerful, empowered women being predators and preying on men in a largely male-dominated literary field was less appealing. It's a thought, could be. One of the only stories in here that comes after Carmilla is actually the only vampire story written by a woman that's in any of these books, which we should probably read another day, because that's really interesting. So, time for Carmilla, by the father of the Victorian ghost story himself, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. So the prologue of this story is from the point of view of Dr. Hesselius, who is this occult doctor character that's kind of reoccurring in Le Fanu's stories. He's ostensibly the collector of all 5 stories in the In a Glass Darkly collection book. And he's gone around and collected these true stories of occult activity to present them as the Occult Doctor. He was actually the first Occult Doctor in literary history, the first person who was investigating occult affairs as this sort of proto-Van Helsing character. And the prologue's from his point of view, and then he does not appear again in the entire rest of the story. So my speculation is that this prologue was added to Carmilla when it was released in A Glass Darkly to tie it into the other stories. Upon a paper attached to the narrative, capital N, which follows, Dr. Hesselius has written a rather elaborate note, which he accompanies with a reference to his essay, capital E, on the strange subject which the manuscript illustrates. The mysterious subject he treats in that essay with his usual learning and acumen, and with remarkable directness and condescension. I love it in old-timey things when condescension is used as a positive thing, like, oh, aren't you lucky that this very learned man is talking down to you in a way that you can understand? You're so fortunate. It will form but one volume of the series of that extraordinary man's collected papers. As I publish the case in these volumes simply to interest the laity, I shall forestall the intelligent lady who relates it in nothing. So he's going to tell it like it is. The story is narrated by an intelligent lady, and he's just going to give it all to us because, God forbid Le Fanu edit his work before he includes it in a collection with other works. And, after due consideration, I've determined, therefore, to abstain from presenting any precis of the learned doctor's reasoning, or extract from his statement on the subject which he describes as involving, not improbably, some of the profoundest arcana of our dual existence and its intermediaries. The dual existence being the proof of the supernatural, that, we have the real world, but in this collection I have proved that ghosts are real and vampires are real. And this being Le Fanu's only vampire story, would have seemed different to his fans than the rest of his stories, so you gotta give it that justification. I was anxious, on discovering this paper, to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before, with a person so clever and careful as his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found that she had died in the interval. So, the lady who narrates the bulk of the story, we have to let you know that she is clever and careful so that you will absolutely believe her story and not think, oh, she's just a stupid little girl, she doesn't know what she's talking about. No, we're letting you know that she's clever and careful, and therefore you must believe her ghost story, vampire story. But she's dead now, so, good luck verifying any of this. She probably could have added little to the narrative, which she communicates in the following pages, with, so far as I can pronounce, such a conscientious particularity. So even though she's dead, we wouldn't even need to ask her any further questions, because it's all right here. And what is right here? Chapter 1. An Early Fright. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle, or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here, in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts, or even luxuries. Interesting way to start a story. She's like, I was rich, but I wasn't really rich, but I was technically rich, so just, you should know from the start that I was rich. Also, the fact that she is an English person, or a person of English descent with an English name and an English father, but living in this mysterious, gothic, foreign land of Styria that's so remote. Styria is in Austria, so gothic. In a schloss. I like that her house is mentioned in the first sentence of the story. It's not a proper Gothic story if it doesn't have a Gothic house. The house makes it. The house is usually a character in itself in most Gothic stories. My father was in the Austrian service and retired upon a pension and his patrimony, and purchased this feudal residence and the small estate on which it stands a bargain. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat, stocked with perch and sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface white fleets of water lilies. Over all this, the schloss shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. The forest opens in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right, a steep Gothic bridge carries the road over the stream that winds in deep shadow through the wood. So when she mentions Gothic things, she's talking about the actual, medieval Gothic, but that's why the Gothic period of the late 1800s is called that, because it was kind of a revival, when all the hipsters were like, oh, we like this old-timey architecture and stuff, and we want to bring it back. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether I say the truth. Looking from the hall door toward the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited schloss of any historic associations is that of old General Spielsdorf, nearly 20 miles away to the right. I have said the nearest inhabited village because there is, only 3 miles westward, that is to say the direction of General Spielsdorf's Schloss, a ruined village, with its quaint little church, now roofless, in the aisle of which are the mouldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau which, in the thick of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the town. So not only do we have a Gothic castle, we have a Gothic forest that's completely remote from anybody of note, and between her and the next person of note, there is a ruined village, abandoned ghost town. How much more Gothic could you get? Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend, which I shall relate to you another time. Yes, this legend is important. We will come back to this legend. I must tell you now how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the schloss. Yes, who would include the servants? She's like, oh, we live with so few people. The party that lives in our house is so small. Not counting the dozens of servants here. They aren't real people. Listen and wonder. My father, who is the kindest man on earth but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19. 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the Schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. I could not remember the time when her fat, benignant face was not a familiar picture in my memory. This was Madame Perrodon, a native of Bern, whose care and good nature in part supplied to me the loss of my mother, whom I do not even remember. So early I lost her. She made a third at our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, a lady such as you term, I believe, a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added English, which, partly to prevent its becoming a lost language among us, and partly from patriotic motives, we spoke every day. The consequence was a babel, at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. And there were 2 or 3 young lady friends besides, pretty nearly of my own age, who were occasional visitors, for longer or shorter terms, and these visits I sometimes returned. So the whole point of what she just said is that 4 people live at her house, not counting the servants. Her dad, her, and her 2 governesses, which I guess they're servants, but they're better than the other servants, so they count. These were our regular social recourses, but of course there were chance visits from our neighbors of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, a rather solitary one, I can assure you. So lonely, so Gothic. My governante had just so much control over me as you might conjecture such sage persons would have in the case of a rather spoiled girl, whose only parent allowed her pretty nearly her own way in everything. The first occurrence in my existence, which produced a terrible impression upon my mind, which in fact never had been effaced, was one of the very earliest incidents of my life which I can recollect. Some people will think it so trifling that it should not be recorded here. You will see, however, by and by why I mention it. The nursery, as it was called, though I had it all to myself, was a large room in the upper story of the castle, with a steep oak roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old, when one night I awoke, and looking round the room from my bed, failed to see the nursery maid. Neither was my nurse there. She had a nursery maid and a nurse. I wonder what the difference is. And I thought myself alone. I was not frightened, for I was one of those happy children who are studiously kept in ignorance of ghost stories or fairy tales, and all such lore as makes us cover up our heads when the door creaks suddenly, or the flicker of an expiring candle makes the shadow of a bedpost dance upon the wall, nearer to our faces. Oh, how sad! You had no spooky stories as a kid? That's so sad. I was vexed and insulted at finding myself, as I conceived, neglected, and I began to whimper, preparatory to a hearty bout of roaring, when, to my surprise, I saw a solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. It was that of a young lady who was kneeling with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands and lay down beside me on the bed, and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully soothed, and fell asleep again. I was wakened by a sensation as if 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly. The lady started back, with her eyes fixed on me, and then slipped down upon the floor, and, as I thought, hid herself under the bed. I was now, for the first time, frightened, and I yelled with all my might and main. Nurse, nursery maid, housekeeper, all came running in, and hearing my story, they made light of it, soothing me all they could meanwhile. But, child as I was, I could perceive that their faces were pale with an unwonted look of anxiety, and I saw them look under the bed, and about the room, and peep under tables, and pluck open cupboards, and the housekeeper whispered to the nurse, "Lay your hand upon that hollow on the bed. Someone did lie there. So sure as you did not, the place is still warm." I remember the nursery maid petting me, and all three examining my chest, where I told them I felt the puncture, and pronouncing that there was no sign visible that any such thing had happened to me. The housekeeper and 2 other servants who were in charge of the nursery remained sitting up all night, and from that time a servant always sat in the nursery until I was about 14. I was very nervous for a long time after this. A doctor was called in. He was pallid and elderly. How well I remember his long, saturnine face, slightly pitted with smallpox, and his chestnut wig. For a good while, every second day, he came and gave me medicine, which I, of course, hated. The morning after I saw this apparition, I was in a state of terror, and could not bear to be left alone, daylight though it was, for a moment. I remember my father coming up and standing at the bedside, and talking cheerfully, and asking the nurse a number of questions, and laughing very heartily at one of the answers, and patting me on the shoulder and kissing me, and telling me not to be frightened, that it was nothing but a dream and could not hurt me. But I was not comforted, for I knew the visit of the strange woman was not a dream, and I was awfully frightened. I was a little consoled by the nursery maids assuring me that it was she who had come in and looked at me, and lay down beside me in the bed, and that I must have been half dreaming not to have known her face. But this, though supported by the nurse, did not quite satisfy me. I get that they're trying to, cheer up this poor, traumatized child, but now they're lying to her, now they're gaslighting her, poor thing. I remember in the course of that day a venerable old man in a black cassock coming into the room with the nurse and housekeeper, and talking a little to them, and very kindly to me. His face was very sweet and gentle, and he told me they were going to pray, and joining my hands together, and desired me to say, softly, while they were praying, "Lord, hear all good prayers for us for Jesus' sake." I think these were the very words, for I often repeated them to myself, and my nurse used for years to make me say them in my prayers. I remember so well the thoughtful, sweet face of that white-haired old man in his black cassock as he stood in that rude, lofty brown room with the clumsy furniture of a fashion 300 years old about him, and the scanty light entering its shadowy atmosphere through the small lattice. He kneeled, and the 3 women with him, and he prayed aloud with an earnest, quavering voice for what appeared to me a long time. I forget all my life preceding that event, and for some time after it is all obscure too, but the scenes I have just described stand out vivid as the isolated pictures of the phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. So yeah, if there was nothing to worry about, why'd you bring in basically an exorcist to cleanse your space? Yeah, that's not going to give a little girl complex. A very scary thing to happen to a poor little 6-year-old. A good gothic start to our story. And we know that she's not a silly kid making this all up because the prologue assured us that she was very smart and very clever. Chapter 2. A Guest. I'm now going to tell you something so strange that it requires all your faith in my veracity to believe my story. It is not only true, nevertheless, but truth of which I have been an eyewitness. It was a sweet summer evening, and my father asked me, as he sometimes did, to take a little ramble with him along that beautiful forest vista which I had mentioned as lying in front of the Schloss. "General Spielsdorf cannot come to us as soon as I had hoped," said my father as we pursued our walk. He was to have paid us a visit some weeks, and we had expected his arrival next day. He was to have brought with him a young lady, his niece and ward, Mademoiselle Reinfeldt, whom I had never seen, but whom I had heard described as a very charming girl, and in whose society I had promised myself many happy days. I was more disappointed than a young lady living in a town or a bustling neighborhood can possibly imagine. This visit and the new acquaintance it promised had furnished my daydream for many weeks. "And how soon does he come?" I asked. "Not till autumn. Not for 2 months, I dare say," he answered. "And I am very glad now, dear, that you never knew Mademoiselle Reinfeldt." "And why?" I asked, both mortified and curious. Because the poor young lady is dead, he replied. I quite forgot I had not told you, but you were not in the room when I received the General's letter this evening. I was very much shocked. General Spielsdorf had mentioned in his first letter 6 or 7 weeks before that she was not so well as he would wish her, but there was nothing to suggest the remotest suspicion of danger. Here is the General's letter, he said, handing it to me. I am afraid he is in great affliction. The letter appears to me to have been written very nearly in distraction. Not distraction, the most Gothic of feelings. We sat down on a rude bench, under a group of magnificent lime trees. The sun was setting with all its melancholy splendor behind the Sylvian horizon, and the stream that flows beside our home and passes under the steep old bridge I have mentioned wound through many a group of noble trees, almost at our feet, reflecting in its current the fading crimson of the sky. General Spielsdorf's letter was so extraordinary, so vehement, and in some places so self-contradictory that I read it twice over. The second time aloud to my father, and was still unable to account for it, except by supposing that grief had unsettled his mind. I like that they're reading this horribly disturbing letter as the sky is turning crimson above them. Yes, a blood-red sky, so ominous. The letter said, I have lost my darling daughter, for as such I loved her. During the last days of dear Bertha's illness, I was not able to write to you. Before then, I had no idea of her danger. I have lost her, and now learn all, too late. She died in the peace of innocence, and in the glorious hope of a blessed futurity. The fiend who betrayed our infatuated hospitality has done it all. I thought I was receiving into my house innocence, gaiety, and a charming companion for my lost Bertha. Heavens, what a fool have I been! I thank God my child died without a suspicion of the cause of her sufferings. She is gone without so much as a conjecturing to the nature of her illness, and the accursed passion of the agent of all of this misery. I devote my remaining days to tracking and extinguishing a monster. I am told I may hope to accomplish my righteous and merciful purpose. At present, there is scarcely a gleam of light to guide me. I curse my conceited incredulity, my despicable affection of superiority, my blindness, my obstinacy, all too late. I cannot write or talk collectedly now. I am so distracted. So soon as I shall have a little recovered, I mean to devote myself for a time to inquiry, which may possibly lead me as far as Vienna. Sometime in the autumn, 2 months hence, or earlier, if I live, I will see you. That is, if you permit me. I will then tell you all that I scarce dare put upon paper now. Farewell. Pray for me, dear friend. So his not-daughter, niece/ward, died from an illness that he blames on a monster that he invited into his home, and he's now going to go hunt down this monster and destroy it. And Laura and her father thinks he's so upset that he's talking crazy talk. In these terms ended the strange letter. Though I had never seen Bertha Reinfeldt, my eyes filled with tears at the sudden intelligence. I was startled as well as profoundly disappointed. Has she mentioned before how lonely she is? How she was like, a friend is coming, I'm going to have a new friend, and now I'm not, and I'm so sad. Yeah, in case you didn't know, she's lonely. The sun had now set, and it was twilight by the time I had returned the General's letter to my father. It was a soft, clear evening, and we loitered, speculating upon the possible meanings of the violent and incoherent sentences which I had just been reading. We had nearly a mile to walk back before reaching the road that passes the Schloss in front, and by that time the moon was shining brilliantly. At the drawbridge, we met Madame Perrodon and Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, who had come out without their bonnets to enjoy the exquisite moonlight. We had heard their voices gabbling in an animated dialogue as we approached. We joined them at the drawbridge, and turned about to admire with them the beautiful scene. The glade through which we had just walked lay before us. At the left of the narrow road wound away under clumps of lordly trees and was lost to sight amid the thickening forest. At the site, the same road crosses the steep and picturesque bridge, near which stands a ruined tower which once guarded that pass, and beyond the bridge an abrupt eminence rises, covered with trees and showing in the shadows some gray ivy-clustered rocks. Yes, a very picturesque scene. So much scenery in this book. Over the sward and low grounds, a thin film of mist was stealing like smoke, marking the distances with a transparent veil, and here and there we could see the river faintly flashing in the moonlight. Oh, there's ground mist coming in. Someone busted out the fog machine. I love it. No softer, sweeter scene could be imagined. I like that it's describing this very classically tropey Gothic scene now, because we've adopted it that way, but to her, it's sweet and soft. The news I had just heard made it melancholy, but nothing could disturb its character of profound serenity, and the enchanted glory and vagueness of the prospect. My father, who enjoyed the picturesque, and I stood looking in silence over the expanse beneath us. The two good governesses, standing a little way behind us, discoursed upon the scene and were eloquent upon the moon. Now, the moon is getting mentioned a lot in here, and that is relevant to vampire tropes, which I will explain later. Madame Perrodon was fat, middle-aged, and romantic, and talked inside poetically. Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, in right of her father, who was a German, assumed to be psychological, metaphysical, and something of a mystic, now declared that when the moon shone with a light so intense, it was well known that it indicated a special spiritual activity. The effort of the full moon in such a state of brilliancy was manifold. It acted on dreams. It acted on lunacy. It acted on nervous people. It had marvelous physical influences connected with life. Mademoiselle related that her cousin, who was mate of a merchant ship, having taken a nap on deck in such a night, lying on his back with his face full in light of the moon, had wakened after a dream of an old woman clawing him by the cheek, with his features horribly drawn to one side, and his countenance had never quite recovered its equilibrium. The moon this night, she said, is full of odelic and magnetic influence. And see, when you look behind you at the front of the schloss, how all its windows flash and twinkle with that silvery splendor, as if unseen hands had lighted up the rooms to receive fairy guests. There are indolent states of the spirits in which, indisposed to talk ourselves, the talk of others is pleasant to our listless ears. And I gazed on, pleased with the tinkle of the ladies' conversation. I have got into one of my moping moods tonight, said my father, after a silence, and quoting Shakespeare, whom, by way of keeping up our English, he used to read aloud, he said, "In truth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me, you say it wearies you, but how I got it, came by it, I forget the rest. But I feel as if some great misfortune were hanging over us. I suppose the poor general's afflicted letter has had something to do with it." So we just had, 3 pages of them talking about the moon, how pretty the moon is, how creepy the moon is, how the moon can cause strange things to happen. And moonlight, up until this point, had been a very big deal in vampire fiction. And that's not a trope that's lasted very much to this day, but especially in Varney the Vampire, which was a penny dreadful novel. I have it on here on my shelf. It's like the biggest book on my shelf. It was a serialized thing. It's like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages long. In that, Varney, the vampire, gets killed a lot because it's like a written soap opera. And every time he gets killed, the moonlight brings him back to life. So the moonlight has this restorative power to Varney. And what Le Fanu is trying to do here in Carmilla, which we'll see more later once we actually meet the character of Carmilla, is turn that trope around a little bit. Take that moonlight is the source of the vampire's power thing and make the moon into this beautifying thing. Make it something that is shining on what's going to be Carmilla's personality. But as the governess says, strange things happen on nights when there's a moon like this. And indeed, at this moment, the unwanted sound of carriage wheels and the many hoofs upon the road arrested our attention. They seemed to be approaching from the high ground overlooking the bridge, and very soon the equipage from that point. 2 horsemen first crossed the bridge, then came a carriage drawn by 4 horses, and 2 men rode behind it. So you got a carriage with 4 horses, and then 2 guys on horseback in front of that, and 2 guys on horseback behind that. A lot of horses. This is a serious business travel equipage. It seemed to be the traveling carriage of a person of rank, and we were all immediately absorbed in watching that unusual spectacle. Has she mentioned how bored and lonely she is? So yeah, this is exciting. It became, in a few moments, greatly more interesting, for just as the carriage had passed the summit of the steep bridge, one of the leaders, taking fright, communicated his panic to the rest, and after a plunge or two, the whole team broke into a wild gallop together. She's talking about the horses. One of the horses in front got scared, and then all the horses got scared. And dashing between the horsemen who rode in front, came thundering along the road towards us with the speed of a hurricane. The excitement of the scene was made more painful by the clear, long-drawn screams of a female voice from the carriage window. We all advanced in curiosity and horror, my father in silence, the rest of us with various ejaculations of terror. Our suspense did not last long. Just before you reach the castle drawbridge, on the route they were coming, there stands by the roadside a magnificent lime tree. On the other side stands an ancient stone cross, at sight of which the horses, now going at a pace that was perfectly frightful, swerved so as to bring the wheel over the projecting roots of the tree. I knew what was coming. I covered my eyes, unable to see it out, and turned my head away. At the same moment, I heard a cry from my lady friends who had gone on a little. Curiosity opened my eyes, and I saw a scene of utter confusion. 2 of the horses were on the ground. The carriage lay upon its side with 2 wheels in the air. The men were busy removing the traces, and a lady, with a commanding air and figure, had got out and stood with clasped hands, raising the handkerchief that was in them every now and then to her eyes. Through the carriage door now was lifted a young lady who appeared to be lifeless. My dear old father was already beside the elder lady with his hat in his hand, evidently tendering his aid and the resources of his schloss. The lady did not appear to hear him, or to have eyes for anything but the slender girl who was being placed against the slope of the bank. I approached. The young lady was apparently stunned, but she was certainly not dead. My father, who piqued himself on being something of a physician, had just had his fingers to her wrist and assured the lady, who declared herself her mother, that the pulse, though faint and irregular, was undoubtedly still distinguishable. The lady clasped her hands and looked upward as if in a momentary transport of gratitude. But immediately she broke out again in that theatrical way which is, I believe, natural to some people. Certainly not Laura. Laura is a very proper lady. She would never be theatrical. She was what is called a fine-looking woman for her time of life, and must have been handsome. She was tall, but not thin, and dressed in black velvet, and looked rather pale, but with a proud and commanding countenance, though now agitated strangely. "Was ever a being so born to calamity?" I heard her say, with clasped hands, as I came up. "Here am I, on a journey of life and death, in prosecuting which to lose an hour is possibly to lose all. My child will not have recovered sufficiently to resume her route for who can say how long. I must leave her. I cannot, dare not, delay. How far on, sir, can you tell us is the nearest village? I must leave her there, and shall not see my darling or even hear of her till my return 3 months hence." I plucked my father by the coat and whispered earnestly in his ear, "Oh, papa, pray ask her to let her stay with us. It would be so delightful. Do pray." "If madame will entrust her child to the care of my daughter and of her good gouvernante, Madame Perronon, and permit her to remain as our guest under my charge until her return, or will confer a distinction and obligation upon us, and we shall treat her with all the care and devotion which so sacred a trust deserves." "I cannot do that, sir. It would be to task your kindness and chivalry too cruelly," said the lady distractedly. "It would, on the contrary, be to confer on us a very great kindness at the moment when we most need it. My daughter has just been disappointed by a cruel misfortune in the visit from which she had long anticipated a great deal of happiness. If you confide this young lady to our care, it will be her best consolation. The nearest village on your route is distant and affords no such inn as you could think of placing your daughter at. You cannot allow her to continue her journey for any considerable distance without danger. If, as you say, you cannot suspend your journey, you must part with her tonight, and nowhere could you do so with more honest assurances of care and tenderness than here." There was something in this lady's air and appearance so distinguished and even imposing, that in her manner so engaging as to impress one quite apart from the dignity of her equipage, the equipage being her carriage and horses and stuff, so, obviously rich and fancy, with the conviction that she was a person of consequence. The lady threw on her daughter a glance, which I fancied was not quite so affectionate as one might have anticipated from the beginning of the scene, Then she beckoned slightly to my father, and withdrew 2 or 3 steps with him out of hearing, and talked with him with a fixed and stern countenance, not at all like that with which she had hitherto spoken. So she at first was like, oh, is me, I have to do this journey, but this carriage accident has made my daughter sick, and I can't do the journey with a sick daughter, but I have to do the journey, it's life or death, what do I do with my daughter? I can't leave her here with you, that would be asking too much. And he's like, no, please, leave her here with us. Has my daughter mentioned she's lonely? She would love a new friend, please do. So she's like, oh, well, in that case. She goes off to have this talk with him, and all of a sudden, all of her, whoa, is me, is gone, and she's talking all serious and stern. And Laura's like, mood whiplash? Huh. I was filled with wonder that my father did not seem to perceive the change, and also unspeakably curious to learn what it could be that she was speaking, almost in his ear, with so much earnestness and rapidity. 2 or 3 minutes at most, I think, she remained thus employed. Then she turned, and a few steps brought her to where her daughter lay, supported by Madame Perrodon. She kneeled beside her for a moment and whispered, as Madame supposed, a little benediction in her ear. Then, hastily kissing her, she stepped into the carriage, the door was closed, the footmen in stately liveries jumped up behind, the outriders spurred on, the postilions cracked their whips, and the horses plunged and broke suddenly into a furious canter that threatened soon again to become a gallop, and the carriage whirled away, followed at the same rapid pace by the 2 horsemen in the rear. That was the end of chapter 2. Laura now has a guest, the one guest she was hoping to get mysteriously died. But hey, new surprise guest. What's the worst that could happen? Everything's going to be fine, especially since the sunset was crimson and the full moon was out. The moon that was very much a vampire trope thing before now. What's the worst that could happen? Well, we'll find out next time. Thank you for joining me for this vampire read-through. Join me again next time to continue our delve into one of the most important Gothic classics of vampire fiction, Carmilla. Thank you for watching my video. Thank you for supporting me here on Vampire Reviews and Vampire Read-Throughs. If you would like to help me make more of these videos, consider joining my Patreon. Otherwise, leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about the story so far. Tell me what stories you would like to read in the future. Next time we're going to continue reading Carmilla by Le Fanu, and we're going to take several videos to do it, so none of them are too long. But they'll all come out fast. Don't worry, you won't have to wait very long. And if you're doing one of those library summer reading challenges, audiobooks count as reading. Mark this one off your list, because you will have gotten through the entire Carmilla with me, the Maven of the Eventide, very soon. Until next time, good night.